This is Houston, contact with a test. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. End of test.
Discovery, Houston. Recommend vector transfer to the BFS.
Discovery's 4 computers now have primary control of critical vehicle functions.
Gillespugin, sitting in front of the computer, is trying to type. He places both hands above the keyboard. He gives up, exhausted, and his hands drop into his lap. After resting for a time, he raises his hands again, only to drop them as before.
My definition of electronic literature is, I want to say stories, because I always associate stories with literature. And electronic means that there has been either some intervention in the authoring process, which involves digital technology, or in the delivery process, which has digital technology.
I try to recall winter as if it were yesterday, she says, but I do not signify one way or another. By 5 the sun sets and the afternoon melt freezes again across the blacktop into crystal octopi and palms of ice, rivers and continents beset by fear, and we walk out to the car, the snow moaning beneath our boots and the oaks exploding in series along the fence line on the horizon, the shrapnel settling like relics, the echoing thundering off far ice. This was the essence of wood, these fragments say, and this darkness is air. Poetry, she says, without emotion, one way or another. I wrote this in Michigan. I actually can remember the sound of, on freezing days, they may not have been oaks exploding, but the trees kind of popping off along the ridge. And I remember also having walked to my office and seen the afternoon melt freezing across the blacktop like crystal octopi. I'm having an incredible deja vu looking at the screen.
My definition of electronic literature would be any form of writing that is dynamic, meaning it can be collaborated on or edited or changed at will.
A check tablecloth laid in an isolated clearing. A bottle of red wine, 2 glasses, cheese, and bread. Walking the sound of water, white-capped sound of water, or a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon set on a wooden tablecloth, cold water, crystal goblets unexpectedly at midnight, purple lupine on the hillside, beside the Dempsey dumpster in town, walking down to the water where the homeless gathered, a flower dress, unexpected woodland events, white-capped spring water in winter, a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon set on a linen tablecloth, cold water, a flower dress, the smell of hops and honey, the smell of green grass, outflow of a stones by the river, the smell of front door, grass, under the eaves of the river, the cabin where we were working, the sound of water, white-capped mountains, purple lupine on the hillside, making love.
Electronic literature is forms of literature that make use of the computer or the network context to achieve effects that wouldn't be possible in print.
My birth takes place more than once in the plea of a bygone monster, from a muddy hole by corpse light, under the needle and under the pen. Or it took place not at all. But if I hope to tell a good story, I must leapfrog out of the muddle of my several births, to the day I parted for the last time with the author of my being and set out to write my own destiny.
So it might start with smell when that's possible in the future. At present it starts with image very dominantly and proceeds through text to sound in kind of a hierarchy, which I very much dislike. But I think the opportunities within that for interaction between those different senses and different means of generating stuff are just
Traversal is a process by which a user, performer, author performs a work of electronic literature on the original hardware and with the original software for which the work was produced. It's intended to capture the cultural context of a work, and that includes everything from sounds to glitches to the look and feel of the interface to the way we interact with the keyboard and those kinds of physical material processes. Structure first.
Yes.
We
yes.
have to structure
equals
first,
meaning.
because you have to understand where your words are going to go.
Yes.
You can't just throw your words on a page.
Hello, welcome. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen-speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples whose traditional relationships with the land continue to this day. The Digital Scholarship Commons at the University of Victoria Libraries is very pleased to host author Tim McLaughlin and Dr. Dene Grigar from from Washington State University, Washington. Vancouver, for a traversal of Tim McLaughlin's hypertext novel, Notes Towards Absolute Zero. Written in 1992 and 93, McLaughlin's novel, McLaughlin's work dates from the pre-web era of hypertext, when the creative potential of the medium was still largely unexplored. Dr. Grigar, director and professor of the Creative Media and Digital Culture program at WSUV Vancouver, will conduct a traversal of McLaughlin's work, a narrated, recorded performance capturing the experience of the work on period 1990s computing technology. Dene Grigar is professor and director of the Creative Media and Digital Culture program at Washington State University, Vancouver, whose research focuses on the creation, curation, preservation, and criticism of electronic literature. With Stuart Moulthrop, University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, she developed the methodology for documenting born digital media, project that culminated in an open source multimedia book entitled Pathfinders, and a book of media art criticism entitled Traversals for the MIT Press. She is president of the Electronic Literature Organization and director of the Electronic Literature Lab at WSUV. Tim McLaughlin is a writer and photographer in Vancouver, based in Vancouver, British Columbia. Over the years, Tim has been active in experimental radio, hypertext fiction. He is included in the Encyclopedia of Literature in Canada, graphic design, book production, and documentary film. In partnership with Charlotte Kwan and Maiwa Handprints, Tim documents artisan communities and advocates for the importance and continuation of traditional craft and culture. Recently, Charlotte and Tim worked together to produce Textiles of the Banjara, Cloth and Culture of a Wandering Tribe, which was published by Thames and Hudson in 2016. My name, by the way, is John Durno. I'm the head of library systems here at the University of Victoria Libraries, and I have a short personal anecdote. Tim and I go back a long way. We worked together at Duthie Books in Vancouver in the 1990s. Back just when Tim's book was being published, and I have to say I first heard the word hypertext in association with Tim. This was a new thing back then, and we were just talking about how you, for a while at least, you had to explain what hypertext was at parties because nobody really understood it, or what it was or what it did. And then that, of course, all changed very, very quickly a couple of years later. In any case, it's great to be able to welcome Tim and Dene to the lab here at the University of Victoria Libraries, and I'll turn it over to them now.
Thank you very much, John. I'd like to thank Dene and the crew here, which is John and Greg, and also the University of Victoria for the opportunity to do this traversal and for the interest in my work. Traversal is a entirely apt term for what we're going to look at today, given the themes of the work that we're going to go through. So keep that in the back of your mind as we encounter the themes that are held in the story, what a traversal is, and what it means to reach your destination. So this work, if you were to buy it circa 1994, I'm dealing with two audiences, the live audience and an online audience, so I'm going to try to engage you both here. This work, you would buy it at a bookstore or you would buy it online, and it came in what looks like a very incredibly slim book, and then you would open it up and you get this kind of gatefold folder affair, and you get a floppy disk, and the floppy disk holds 1.4 megabytes of information, which means that when this work was authored, in order to get the graphics onto this work, they had to become bitmaps. Bitmaps are kind of the halftone of the digital world. A bitmap is just a graphic that's only either black or white. There's no grayscale involved at all, which means that all the images in a bitmap form can be incredibly tiny. So in my opinion, it gives the work a kind of gritty resonance that clearly is evocative of the time it was written. So you would load this onto your computer. You get the title screen, which says Notes Toward Absolute Zero, Hypertext Fiction by Tim McLaughlin. And you click on that, and you get the instructions, which I'll read just to familiarize you with the work. Notes Toward Absolute Zero, copyright 1993. That's when I submitted the work. The disc bears a copyright of 1995. And when I first got copies that I was able to have a launch on, it happened at the Vancouver Film School, and that was in September 1996. So the words say, you travel through the fiction by clicking directly onto the text, or by double-clicking on the images and then pressing the return key. To page forward, keep pressing the return key. To move back, use the back arrow on the bar below. That's this bar here. To page forward, keep pressing the return key. Sorry, some of the screens contain words which yield to additional spaces. To see these words, hold down the Control and Option keys at the same time, then double-click the boxed words to follow the link. In some systems, the elements are best selected by dragging the mouse across them rather than double-clicking. So you can see the word next has got a wireframe box around it. And so if we double-click on that, we get the conclusion. On the bottom of the screen is a toolbar. The strip contains an arrow which will take you back to the previous screen, a browse icon which will display a range of possible pathways, an H which will take you back home to the beginning, and a print icon which will send the current page to the printer. The toolbar may be moved by a click and drag motion. You may want to move the bar down as it covers some of the images. So when this work originally shipped for very old Macintosh computers, that white screen outline would fill the entire viewing screen. So you couldn't actually ever move that little toolbar down below because you didn't have enough screen real estate to be able to do that. So we begin reading. I'm going to take us through some of the pathways of this, and then as you can see, we have a collage of postage stamps here. I'm actually going to start asking for your feedback to help select some of the pathways through the text. So this work has the conceit of a collage of postal stamps. A previous edition was titled The Correspondence of Miguel Constantine, and he's one of the central characters in the work. It later was retitled as Notes Toward Absolute Zero, which has implications for the idea of traversal. So if I start with this stamp, this is an interesting place to start because it has the original Canadian postage stamp on it in the very, very center, which is a 3-pence beaver. It was reissued as 15 cents, I believe, sometime in the 1930s. In the humanities, in the time when I grew up, Canadian culture was a vital and very important consideration for authors of works. And so I've happily incorporated as much Canadian content into this work as I could. So we've gone from the collage to the large-scale stamp, and then we encounter the text. You must remember that in the beginning there are no rules. It is necessary to work quickly before everything freezes. We arrive in the morning like critics who feel the cinema is our own. In the theater, it is still dark because there are no windows, but we know it is morning. Our sense of time has not been dulled by the feature's narrative. I lean into the seat that holds me as you move forward, removing a scarf. When the house lights go down, perhaps their hands grow together, perhaps their knees touch, or a head rests on a shoulder. I see the projector flood the room with the opening scenes from Lumiere's L'Arrivée d'un train de gare de la Clotte. The light is modern and clean, unclouded by cigarette smoke. Above me, the projectionists sit in a booth papered with movie posters. They are playing crib, talking directors and jazz, waiting to change reels. The metal canisters arrive heavy with masking tape, notices, and stamps from the customs of different countries. We remove the first 4 rows of seats from the theater. Between features, with the help of the concession stand operator, we bring in the large bathtub from my apartment. Its clawed feet are bolted to the floor, and hoses run down the aisles to provide hot water. We wash each other, run bars of scented soap over our bodies, bathing in the warm fragrance of grapefruit and almond. Or we waltz, wet-toweled and dripping, to the soundtrack, towels falling through aisles 7 and 8. On the screen, the silent silhouette of an embrace. They watch each other watching. The projector moves between them with its shadowed marble grain. And so that pathway I've taken by simply pressing the return key after each screen of text. And it gives you kind of a default pathway that you can go through. So I showed you before, when I hold these 2 keys down, we get wireframes around all the possible choices. It's also possible to make decisions within any of those screens to take it in a second way. So one of the ways that reading works in this piece is you can follow default pathways, and then you can make excursions. So if you know there's a familiar pathway, you can embrace the familiarity, or you can try and make deviations off that pathway. Let's choose this one. There was great popular interest in the Franklin expedition. Lady Franklin kept financing voyages to search the Arctic, but when the first of Leopold McClintock's fantastic reports came back, the public was incredulous. It was only gradually that they began to accept that something very strange had happened. As time passed, the list of what was carried away by the expedition grew by accretion. Someone would add a roll-top desk or a keg of bath powder. The next time the story was repeated, they would be carrying cast-iron cooking stoves, even though there was no firewood for 200 miles. If the story was told again, the crew would be crossing the Arctic with an ornate tea service, brass beds, grandfather clocks, and a penny farthing. In the end, the expedition was hauling the entire assemblage of Victorian tradition over the ice, boot polish, embroidered tapestries, and lace handkerchiefs, mustache wax, filigree picture frames with silver inkwells, all the heavily decorated ornament of mourning. Sometime between 1848 and 1857, Captain Henry Kellett took charge of the Resolute and sailed for the Arctic. Like so many others, he was searching for evidence of the Franklin expedition. As the ice thickened and the floes began to grind, the ship set its winter moorings just off Dealey Island. They were not alone in the Arctic. Supply ships would arrive to help the stranded, only to be frozen in themselves. When the pack ice shifted, the hulls would tilt obscenely, the masts and articulate rigging crooked by the pressure. Under the orders of Sir Edward Belcher, the Resolute and 4 other vessels were abandoned. All hands were crammed aboard the North Star. Spring breakup released the ships. Those that had been nipped by the ice slowly sank, but the Resolute simply floated away. The empty ship drifted through the northern waters and ice packs. Frost grew in ice flowers on the rigging and deck. Creaking wood spoke to the water, and the waters answered. The crack of paper ice would drift up almost slowly to circle the masts. More than a year after it was abandoned, the ghost ship was found by American whalers in the Davis Strait. It was taken to Connecticut, where the US government paid the whalers, refurbished the ship, and offered it as a gift to Queen Victoria. This looks like an interesting postage stamp. This says 1974, Canada. And it takes me to a second collage of postal stamps. Let's choose this one. This is a postal stamp from the UK, and it's the Edinburgh Mail, snowbound in 1831. It was snowing. If you opened your mouth, your tongue became snowbound. From Landscape Painted with Tea by Milorad Pavic. So now I'm going to ask for, should I choose snowing or snowbound? These are going to be very easy questions. You can just shout out an answer. Snowbound. The station. When Jericho arrived at the station, it was so cold that the entire train froze solid and could not be moved for 3 days. The engine starved on the tracks. A white moss of frost grew down the sides of the sleeping cars, climbed in through the windows, and rested in the luggage, folded itself into the space between socks and underwear. All around the station it was still. The passengers who were traveling east through the prairies, through the enormous and empty wheat fields, were held within the small circle of hotels next to the station, forgotten. The train and the cold arrived together and tightened the air into the skin of a drum, an arid and desolate bitterness that snapped the branches off small trees and solidified car tires so that they rolled with a flat spot, thumping, like driving on a corduroy road until hours later the motion warmed the rubber and the sound died away. Jericho. Jericho was unpacking in the hotel room. Cold, cold, cold. Opening her suitcase, she removed her clothes and touched the artificial satin of the suitcase lining, almond white. She ran her open palm over the bedspread, smoothing it, then along the wallpaper, feeling the brocade of raised ornamental flowers. In this way, she circled the room, bending over dresser and chair, holding the walls in her hands. At the window, she stopped. Frost blocked the sun and closed her into a fine white envelope, sharp, serious. With her index finger, she drew on the window, giving an edge to the paper and printing another piece of funeral stationery. Funeral envelope, sun cold. Funeral. All right. Wreath. Well, that was in Vancouver, and it rained. Rained a lot. It rained all day from the time I looked out my kitchen window in the morning until I arrived back at night. I had to take the funeral wreath to the cemetery, so I used his old suitcase. I felt odd about going on the bus with a funeral wreath. And the wreath was filled with freesia, which I didn't want to ruin. So I waited for what must have been an hour in the rain, waiting for the bus. It was Sunday. And well, there was just me and the minister and the guy from the funeral home. That's all. Just the three of us. They're standing under the canopy beside the coffin. They are so damn solid, I'm sure they must last forever. I just remember taking out the wreath and placing it down there, placing it down where the stone would go. It was good to smell the flowers beside the fresh earth. Then taking this empty suitcase away, so light and empty. Suitcase, coffin, freesia. Freesia. Insomnia. The smell of freesia on your hands is strong. There are nights when its presence alone is enough to wake you. It pulls you up from sleep and leaves you insomniac, touches you with its warm heart, its hands soft and floral, reaching around your collarbone, turning your hair to fine stems. Insomniac or hands? Insomniac. Sleep. Jericho was an insomniac. She spent the night in a state of even tedium, and in the morning, she was as tired as when she went to bed. She was happy if she slept maybe 30 minutes out of the night. Once something disturbed her, she would remain awake. Slipping back into the folds of sleep was as difficult as trying to continue an interrupted dream. She would try many tricks, such as lying exactly how she was when she woke, arms and legs placed in the warm impressions in the bed, hoping the charm would work. But in her heart, she knew the sleep was lost. The remainder of the night would be filled by waiting, waiting for the morning, waiting for the sky to tinge with gray or pale blue. Insomniac, tedium, dream, or tinge. Tension. There is a mounting tension in the rooms and in the hotel. It is born out of the inactivity. People are restless and waiting for their several journeys to continue. Winter has the odd sensation that as soon as things continue, they will end. Waiting sensation or return. We can also do a default. Waiting. Oops. Okay. Icebreaker. An odd name considering the untold numbers of ships crushed effortlessly by the lethargic flows of the Arctic. Later, with stronger hulls, the vessels wouldn't break up quite so easily. Instead, they simply got caught, crystallized for a time like insects caught in amber. The Stanley, a successor to the Northern Light, was once held in the ice for 60 days, a small holiday compared to the previous explorers. But what did they think of, sitting on a boat in the frozen ocean? Think or return? Return? Oh, we're back at the front. I don't know how much you can make out from these, but this is a station, this is a train, this is a train. Let's make it easy. Let's say a stamp of the Queen or a train, one of the engines. Train, okay. Canadian stamp, 32 cents. This is a story that takes place in the space between movement. It begins when you realize that you can control your departure, but not your arrival. If you find yourself somewhere else, perhaps gathered into the hypnotic sway of a sleeping car, it is because you have given up control over something. Travel is a conversation between places. Let's try return on that one. GWR, the Great Western Railway. You are in a passenger car of the Great Western Railway on the Sarnia Express, midway between London and Kamoka. It is a winter evening in early December. The train carries petroleum cars, baggage cars, and one passenger car. You are sleepy-eyed, dozing in the comforting sway of the carriage and the rhythmic sound of the steel wheels on the tracks. Halfway to Kamoka, an oil lamp in the closet falls to the floor. The oil ignites, and soon the entire closet is filled with smoke and flames. The train is not traveling fast, just over 30 miles an hour, but the speed is great enough to fan the fire and spread it to the rest of the car. Now panic spreads more quickly than the flames. The only hope is to stop the train, but there is no bell rope and no way to call the engineer. The conductor crawls along the tops of the cars to give the word as passengers begin throwing themselves out into the blue-white snow on the embankment. Within a few minutes, the car is consumed, and those who could not escape die horribly by fire. Now we still have trains, and we have a few queens, and we have this very interesting stamp here. Film. This is a stamp from the United Kingdom with a film star, 31 pence. Snapshot 1. This is how it began. I ran an ad in the paper that said, I'm looking for faces. Any faces. People always seem happy to respond, and I'm honored, as if they were anxious to offer up their eyes, their mouths, and cheeks to me. You might think I set up a camera, nothing elaborate, perhaps just a Polaroid on a tripod. Instead, I invited them into my office, and then, one by one, I took them through the back door, across the intersection, down through the subway stop, to the photo booth. I could get 4 pictures for $1. Black and white. The subjects left, and I kept the pictures. Later, alone, I could go through them. I kept only the best picture of each and threw the rest away. 1 picture was all I needed. This is what I have. I'm going to go through them a young woman with a gap between her front teeth. A man holds a child and smiles. The child is terrified. A man alone, unflinching in a tuxedo. A woman with her head turned left. A daughter and a mother facing each other smiling. A young boy wearing thick black-rimmed glasses. A man with a dog, a great Irish setter. The dog is blurred, trying to get away. A woman with roses. 3 teenage girls, their faces distorted as they try to push each other out of the range of the camera. A nun. 2 men with their arms crossed as each clutches the other's nose. And all 4 pictures of you. So this is a little interface note. If you press return and there's nowhere to go, you get that little audio prompt, which means you have to, it's a hypertextual dead end. So we can use the back arrow to get back. And I can use the home to get through again. Now, any choices for stamps here? This looks like a sheep. There's a couple dogs here. A dog? All right, let's do the dog. He also had an intense phobia. He was terrified of dogs. The smallest terrier could send him running, but the larger dogs, the German Shepherds and Dobermans, could cause him to become absolutely hysterical. This fear almost killed him once. Killed him, he, phobia, hysterical. Phobia. Hypnosis. Emil Kuhl's laws of reversed effect. When the will and the imagination are in conflict, the imagination always wins. When the will and the imagination are in conflict, the force of the imagination is in direct ratio to the square of the will. When the will and the imagination are in agreement, one does not merely add to the other, but one is multiplied by the other. This is willpower. Harmony between the chooser, harmony between will, the chooser, and imagination, the power. The imagination can be directed. Oh, another dead end. Okay. Any other selections? John. Let me put you on the spot.
All right, well, how about
Another train. I don't think we've chosen that one. There's that one. Longer locomotive, 34 cents Canadian. Accidents. Every technology provokes, programs a specific accident. For example, when they invented the railroad, at the same time they invented the railroad catastrophe. The invention of the boat was the invention of shipwrecks. The invention of the steam engine and the locomotive was the invention of derailments. The invention of the highway was the invention of 300 cars colliding in 5 minutes. From Pure War by Paul Virilio. Radiant. After an accident, the time immediately preceding it is reconfigured. The brief moments before disaster suddenly hold nothing but promise. Careers have finally moved beyond setbacks. Relationships have gained new hope and courageous strength. Arcane mathematical problems were solved and incomparably beautiful poems conceived. You might hear people say, yes, it was a truly wonderful time. People radiated happiness, movement, warmth. We lived in the center of the world and everything was going our way, but then, of course, there was the accident. It is as if one had to show that the unusual course of events had already been disturbed and the disaster was, in some sense, a drastic and unfortunate overcompensation. Prescience works in reverse. After a catastrophic event, there always seem to be those who will say that they saw it coming. It was in the cards. Had we been more careful, we would have noticed. For these people, it is as if the future is as predictable as the past. Events can be known in the same way an epileptic knows that they are about to have a seizure. with that kind of dramatic intuition. And you realize that you've been here before. Take two trains. One is a freight train with 124 cars. The other is a 7-car passenger train, express. Put them on the same track as if you were playing with a toy railroad. Point them at each other and let them roll down the tracks on the main line. Rest your toolkit on the dead man's pedal. Crumple the 4 locomotives like thin newspaper, then set that newspaper on fire. Spill hopper cars of wheat into the snow. In the midst of this muscular comedy, think to yourself of winter wheat lying asleep in the earth. Tunnel a pipeline through the air. Become the man looking out the dome of the observation car. Feel your skin tighten and itch as you realize that the approaching light of the freight train is on your track and neither of you is braking and there is no switch. There is no abrupt braking, only the train crumpling and folding itself into the mountainside. And I'm going to cut through to the other interface. So there's 2 panes with these collages, and I've put 2 tunnels that you would discover after using the work for a while to get back and forth between the 2. And they're these 2 artist stamps, not official currency, but designed by Canadian artists as something known as artist stamp. I think we can go through a few more, and then Elvis, okay, thank you. Elvis. I know there's intimacy in narrative. I've seen it in what passes between people watching the late B movie on Friday nights. I can feel the warmth as one returning from the beer can light of the fridge looks to the other and asks, did he make it too? And for a moment, those inside the cathode spill share something mysterious and binding. Oh. Jericho got up to leave the lobby. Sorry, I have to go now. Call my room after dinner and we'll talk some more. Or better yet, why don't you get a bottle of wine from the bar and bring your photographs and we'll look at them. They have talked all afternoon in the hotel lobby, plotted escapes and winter expeditions with snowshoes, dreamed of dog sleds and other nostalgic myths of the Canadian winter. They have incorporated the reception clerks and bellboys into their scheming and made a camp film out of their adventure. Here, they are besieged by potted plants, plush chromed furniture, and bad paintings, which look as if they could be found in an art discount sale, or perhaps a starving artist roadside display. Canadian winter, Jericho photographs. Your trail. In the blue Canadian winter, I'll follow your trail till your love becomes a snowbank, hardened by gale. When ice appears on matchsticks and the salt trucks fail, and coal men hibernate through their alarms. That's lyrics from the Rheostatics. Blue Canadian winter, your trail, ice. Ice, okay. Ice, Seco, winter ice, glacier ice, river ice, sea ice, lake ice, candle crystals floating in fresh water, Gropel, heavily rimmed snow, hoar, frost, white mold on windows, rime, cloud crystals, and the specific ice of place, middle ice, floating through the Gulf of Boothia, machine ice, groomed in arenas and public squares, Nihilus, a thin sheet of ice covering the surface of Arctic waters, black ice, fatal in winter, hail, snow, sleet, slush, or the summer ice, found at the Esso, bagged cube ice, blocks for coolers, watermelon, beer. Cocktail, iceworm, common name for, forgive me if I don't read that, a dark pigmented icolate worm up to 4 centimeters long, found in tangled masses and melting ice of glaciers in the Pacific Northwest, from the Canadian Encyclopedia. This is a stamp, this is a full stamp, this is a stamp that I've put together. And it says up here, Car Shops Ruins. This stamp is put together from a photograph of the car shops which are in London, Ontario, which is where they used to repair and refurbish the rolling stock of the railroad. History of ruin. In the hotel room, Jericho and Winter were lying together, sharing warmth. She had begun to fill in the spaces of her past with stories, building pathways that led Winter out from the little that he knew of her. He tried to follow cautiously, but he was betrayed by the strength of his own curiosity. Early ruins. My first lover ruined me for barbershops. When we got drunk, we'd cut each other's hair. It made a great ritual in the kitchen chair with a bedsheet, scissors, and combs, terrorizing one another with a cut. No mirrors were allowed. The one who got done first usually fared better. Toward the end, we'd get a little manic, wailing, flailing, waving the razor, slipping in the clippings. Middle ruins. A second lover ruined me for bookstores. After I left him, I couldn't look through the shelves without hearing his persistent commentary. He chewed parsley to hide his love of garlic, and he always kept a large clump in his pocket, chewing, watching me scan the shelf. His chlorophyll breath recommended titles told me which authors were perverse, sadistic, or starved for sex with pre-Raphaelite women. Final ruins. Certain men have ruined me for airports with the longing of their goodbyes, such sad farewells. Other relationships left me unable to walk down a particular aisle in the supermarket or stop at a cafe. Once an intense and consuming love affair destroyed a whole country for me. The trains, buses, street names, everything. She marks the emphasis, and Winter is jealous to be, in her eyes, that individual who is worth an entire nation. I began to avoid atlases or travel agents for fear of despondence. Gradually, my world was getting smaller and smaller. There were fewer places I wanted to go. And now I have met you, and I wonder just how small my world can get. This is another false stamp. This is Miguel, the uncle of Jericho. Miguel was a man of odd beliefs. The trouble was, I could never tell if he truly believed what he said or if he was just saying these things to amuse me. He was inscrutable and funny in that way. Jericho paused, collected herself, and settled deep into her chair. Winter watched her hands as she spoke. Her wrists were impossibly thin and freckled. My uncle was the type of person who believed that everything could be reduced to lists. Names of the dead, the anatomy of the body, descriptions of exotic foods. For him, each list was a seduction. He believed that a list could seduce a group of people in the same way that a language could seduce an entire population. He stared at her, fascinated. What did he do? He was a hypnotist. She watched Winter smile at this, watched to see if the smile would become a smirk. He smiled, but the eyes communicated nothing. He encouraged her, begged her to tell him more. He also had an intense phobia. He was terrified of dogs. The smallest terrier could send him running, but the larger dogs, the German Shepherds and Dobermans, could make him absolutely hysterical. This fear almost killed him once. So this is the first time we've encountered the second node, which is pretty good time. I think we've been going about 30 minutes now. Phobia 2. Jericho paused. You don't really want to hear this, do you? My parents thought my uncle was fake, as well as a bit of a nut. But I loved him, despite, or maybe because of, all his quirks. No, please go on. Inside, Winter cringed and scolded himself for sounding like a therapist. Okay, well, he was walking down the street, coming back from the bank. He had just rounded the corner when he met a blind woman and her seeing-eye dog. He panicked and ran into the street. He was hit by a bread truck and spent a month in hospital. There's just one choice here, fake, so I'm going to take that one. False beginning. We arrive in the morning like critics who feel the cinema is our own. In the theater, it is still dark because there are no windows. But we know it is morning. Our sense of time has not been dulled by the feature's narrative. I lean into the seat that holds me as you move forward, removing a scarf. Okay. Salvation 6. Jericho wrapped the scarf around her neck and stuffed the envelopes into her pocket. But on the first breath, the dank musk of the scarf caught in her throat and she involuntarily retched. Her hand unwound the scarf from her neck, trailing it away behind her, dragging it behind as she held her chest and recovered her breath. Scarf again. Hiding. Someone's hiding in the back of this literary machine with inappropriate words and rejected phrases. A small voice that occasionally demands the first person. Go into the world. Observe as if you don't understand joy. Look at these people and what they do. Memorize faces on subway trains. Peel back parka hoods, cutaway scarves, and unshoulder overcoats. Perhaps the world is a cinematograph, and there's no right way of seeing. Perhaps this is simply how things are. It's a tricky word. Cinema. I wanted to live my life like cinema, but I was afraid there was no film in the camera. I feared the crew would be composed of absurdist monsters. One of them would replace the blanks with real bullets. I knew with certainty the financial backers would demand a scene with a car chase and another in which large breasts are almost revealed. I was not strong enough to undertake these countless aesthetic battles, this war of design. I couldn't confront the censor board, although deep in my unheard heart, part of me wanted to work for them, wanted to have that kind of power over what is visible. Instead, I live like photography, static, arrested. And this one we've already followed. I'm going to go through and relic, I think. This is a Canadian postage stamp, a relic. It's the relics of the Franklin expedition. Relic. She had a small scar, a line of raised flesh with marks from the stitches on either side. It was on her pelvis, the relic of a childhood operation. I found it strangely beautiful, like the impression of a centipede trapped under her skin, a fossil from her past. Dijon mustard made her sneeze. The gestures I remember. Murmuring under the arch of your back, hiding in your shoulders, hollow. Watching the geography of your face break into a smile. Laughing through thickets of hair, cool, cool cheek against stomach and scar. Listening to your architecture. The bones, the bones, the bones, the edge of your skeleton, the torn fabric of your skin. Times when I think of you, I cannot believe this. I miss you like a creeping madness up my spine, a feast of rose petals in the mouth of an amnesiac, something pure. But this is only vanity. I needed you in the same way Narcissus needed a beautifully still pond, depravity, fascination. Loneliness grows in my heart like the memory of stones. At times, the strength of her will frightens him. She could be lost in the wilderness and enjoy the challenge of finding her way back. She's not happy unless there is an opposing force, something to work against. At other times, he thinks that her strength has worn her out. When the emotions run close to the surface, he thinks that she is very delicate, fragile. The sound of a plate breaking could kill her. Winter thinks to himself that perhaps he has made her sound awkward or strange, criminal. She wasn't. She was just extreme. When she was happy, her whole body would fill with the emotion until she was so buoyant that she could hardly stay on the ground. She hopped. In the same way that a perfectly symmetric face has a specific kind of horror, her beauty came from imbalance. And I'm happy to stop there, but if anybody wants another stamp selected, I'm also happy to go on.
What's the one to the immediate left with 0?
This one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is a Moroccan stamp, and this is the King of Morocco. This is a nice short passage. Badi. Perhaps the only building that is truly complete is the ruin. The chronicler chronicler El Ifrani tells of a fantastic palace built in Marrakesh, in the heart of Morocco, El Badi, the incomparable. The palace walls were 2 meters thick. A central courtyard held a vast garden of over 100 pools and fountains. Each square of the garden held a different tree, and each tree held a different songbird. Ahmed El Mansour imported 50 tons of marble from Italy and paid for it pound for pound in sugar. The workers were well rewarded for their labors, and El Mansour even went so far as to attend to the entertainment of their children, so that they might devote themselves entirely to their craft without distraction. The incomparable took 24 years to build. The enormous costs would have crippled the state, but El Mansour had been victorious in the summer of 1578, defeating King Dom Sebastiano and almost the entire Portuguese nobility at the Battle of Three Kings, stemming what was essentially a Portuguese crusade. The Portuguese paid a huge ransom, and El Mansour used all of it to build his palace. The state opening was attended by several European powers, and there was not a sheikh or siad in the kingdom who was not present. Well pleased with his creation, El Mansour asked his court jester for an opinion on the palace. "Sidi," the man replied, "this will make a magnificent ruin." The words were prophetic. 94 years later, the jealous Moulay Ismail spent 10 years systematically tearing apart the palace to build his new capital at Meknes. The workers were beaten, abused, and starved. When they died, they were buried in the walls where they fell. Every form of ornament was removed. All that remained were the red mud walls and the empty pools, bricks and earth. That's all true, incidentally.
Interesting is just we have an online folks. We have about 10 or 15 people online. These are people from Washington State University Pullman and the graduate course that I'm teaching electronic literature, and from my lab at the University of Washington State University in Vancouver, who are working in my lab as undergraduate researchers. So we have lots of folks, and we have some staff and folks like that. So I want to welcome everybody, the online and on-site audiences. And we generally do a Q&A with the artist after a traversal because it allows you to ask questions, and I moderate that. So I'm going to be typing answers and taking questions from people online and having Tim answer them so we can get a good sense of what this work was about. In a way, this is like a little bit of an interview, so you get to ask him artist-type questions. Okay, so let's get started. That was wonderful reading. I want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
So do we have any questions to start with? Anybody? And let's start with the on-site audience. Anyone here with a question?
Oh yeah, thank you so much. It was kind of fascinating to hear you read. I guess point of view is always interesting. Point of view is always interesting. I think especially in a hypertext, and in that case, you could see a first-person point of view, a second-person point of view. There's a third-person point of view. What were you thinking, and how did you kind of think around point of view, or did it just emerge out of the writing process?
Yeah, there are kind of two approaches to that. A number of spaces or threads through there suggested themselves to me that they were almost traditional passages in a work like you would find in a novel. So there's conversation, there's dialogue, the character's thinking something, the other character's thinking something. Then there are passages which were much more omniscient in their feeling, and I think a lot of the foreboding comes from those passages coming through, which are not necessarily negative or dark in their implications in themselves, but once the work starts to unfold, they have all these implications for what's about to come next. Interestingly, when you author a work like this, your sense of the balance between those two comes from just going through the interface. And so I've versioned it in a number of ways, both in a hard copy and in the electronic version. And it's a very interesting process to get the flow to work almost in any outcome, any stream of screens that you can have. So yeah, I was essentially looking for two distinct points of view, one an omniscient narrator and one more of a traditional unfolding of a tale.
So Jill's online. She's one of the graduate students working on her PhD at Pullman. She asked, do you have any tips for writing hypertext narratives? You guys might want to know that too.
Geez, that's a good question.
Good question.
Well, yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about this interface, which I find absolutely amazing. For this particular reason, you can, with this story space interface done this way, you have a single screen of information presented to you at one time. And as you know, the book format permits a whole hierarchy of text. You can have endnotes, you can have epigraphs, you can have breakout text, you can structure the text so that there's a primary text and a secondary. Here, everything you see is primary. It's almost like a video or a film animation of a text in that whatever's in front of you at that time is of prime importance. There is no secondary text. There is only that one text, which is a wonderful experience that you can't do in any other media. Like if I hand you a printed book, you right away you know how long it is, how thick it is, you can flip through it. Even as you read, you know there's paragraphs before, paragraphs after. Illustrations in a book tend to be incidental or illustrative. They don't tend to be part of the narrative. With this interface, whatever is in front of you is literally in front of you and nothing else exists at that point. So that's a feature of the interface that you could take advantage of. If you're, I guess the tip is how to author a hypertext, which is a huge question, but that would be my answer to that. Take advantage of that interface to motivate the types of feelings that you as an artist wish to achieve.
I have a question for you. So Rob Kendall, one of our mutual friends, has been editing word circuits for, I don't know, 25 years. And in his criticism of the work, which is actually the best piece written about your work, I think, thus far, he calls it a philatelic novella. Do you want to describe what he means by that?
Sure. So philately is the study of stamps and postage stamps. So it's philatelic in that the interface is based on postage stamps. If we go through the work more in depth, you'll encounter scenes where there's correspondence that's passing back and forth. There's essentially three characters here. There's Winter and Jericho, who are man and woman who are go through a short relationship in love. Then there's Jericho's uncle named Miguel, who's the hypnotist, a stage performer. And she loses him and tries to rediscover him. And when she does rediscover him, he's gone. We encountered the passage with the funeral, and all she has from him is a suitcase with empty envelopes in it. So these themes come through the work again and again, and communication by the post is a type of traversal. A traversal is, there's train journeys going on here, there's train wrecks going on here, there's ship crossings going on here, there's ship disasters going on here. In this, the era that this was written, there's tremendous technological euphoria in the idea that computers will solve almost all of our problems, and the future is going to be so amazing and so easy. So I was working a little bit against that technological euphoria.
Question here?
Yeah, kind of going off of that. Kind of going off of what you just mentioned, there were passages about like new technology and danger immediately associated with it, like with the highways, and also passages about like great monuments becoming ruin. I was just wondering, like how much the medium you were writing in kind of affected those themes of kind of like how temporary these great achievements are. I was wondering how much that affected your writing of this piece.
Well, yeah, quite a bit, as it turns out. I mean, we're here. I'd like to remind everyone that this is Endangered Data Week, and this data, as Dene can tell you far more accurate than I can, all this data is deeply endangered. And so for this work, it hasn't taken that long for it to become almost untenable and unreadable as a work. It was published, it came into popular view in 1996. The interfaces that can play it start to disappear probably, 2006, not that long.
This is built in for Apple OS 9.2. So as you know, about 1998, System 10 was introduced, and it allowed for backward compatibility for classic environments for about 5 years. By 2006, we see that disappear. So by 2006, this work became unreadable just from the operating system, but it also had already been long unreadable on Apples from 1998 onward that were just CD-ROMs in this format. If you bought the CD-ROM version, which I have a copy of as well, then you could read that until the CD-ROMs disappeared out of your computer. So it's not just the software, it's also the hardware, right? It's a problem at both ends.
This problem is larger in literature. We're in the library right now, and libraries are all concerned with preservation of books and information. We're also concerned with the preservation of electronic literature books. But if you look at the problem of, we don't often think of the problem of preserving a book. You think, book sits on the table, it's not going to disappear, it's not going to disintegrate, it's not going to be unreadable if it's looked after. But the reverse is actually very, very true. The most physical objects in libraries are not that old as objects. So what ELIT does is it really compresses that issue and makes it hugely poignant that these works are, I would say, a lot of them are almost all gone already. Well, except for Dene will maybe talk a little bit more about her work, but she's done a heroic act in trying to preserve all these works. But the point I'm getting at here just a little bit before that is that there's an interpretation of literature and its ephemerality which is highly focused due to e-literature works.
So one interesting thing that happened to me when I was teaching last semester, I was teaching digital storytelling. And there's this really great piece by a woman who's working at Bothell in which she uses AR technology. And so you have the book with the AR codes, and you hold the book up to the computer screen and the camera will read the codes and display these incredible animations and words, and it's just the most beautiful thing you ever saw. And I have 4 or 5 copies of this book, right? And I have lots of computers that can read it with the camera. However, what was interesting about this, and the reason I'm telling the story, is that the ink on the book is starting to fade. So when I was trying to use the book to show this work to my students last semester, the ink had already become too light in a book that's supposed to last a long time for me to be able to show the AR environment. So in that case, the technology inside the computer medium was lasting longer than the physical book, which was completely ironic and different from anything I've been teaching all semester long. I did not know this was happening until I went, oh, look, let me show you Amrit's work. And I went, look, it's not working. Oh, it's not working. And I kept doing this, and I realized if I took and I tested it by taking a march lot and painting in the darkness, and then it worked. So it really was an issue with the ink. So I think that's just really weird. So Roz is asking online, could you say a little bit more, Tim, about your writing process, particularly with drafting? Does it mostly happen digitally? Shall I get some examples here?
Let's do that. So an interesting thing about this work that I like to bring out was that the initial number of initial passages were authored in the west coast of Ireland while living in a very cold, very damp cottage on a manual typewriter. I was working on hypertext research at that time, and so I brought those works back, and in the spring, March, April of 1993, the research project I was doing was an evaluation of hypertext formats for literary artists, and so we started to author one as an example of the medium, and that's where this work comes from. So I think as an artist, you kind of do whatever you want to do to get the effect that you would like. So I was very comfortable with print, but obviously very comfortable with the electronic format as well. So I would print it off and sort of see how it's scanned as a physical copy. That has a whole number of formatting issues because the screens are obviously of a certain size. This is of a certain size. It's got a print button there, but I've never found that to be terribly effective to print out the screen. So you can put it into different formats to see how it falls together. Always your final run through it is always the actual interface that you want to deliver it as. These are also a great way to just do text corrections and hunt through for typos and stuff like that. In the last year, about a year and a half ago, I was deeply worried about the future of this work. So my initial attempt at preservation was to fire up my old G4 computer and with my iPhone take shots of the screen. Each screen as it come out. I would say that was a little bit frustrating. I then realized that a simpler way and more accurate representation would be to do screenshots. So I did that, and there's 440 screens on that. So I did screenshots of the work, and then I do a lot of book design and print design. So I put them in InDesign and printed them all out as a stack of cards so that if my gear doesn't work anymore, I can at least say, well, this is what you would have seen. Then the book designer in me took over, and I said, you know, I would love to make this into a physical book that you could actually read. And I'll pass this around so that everybody can look at it. But a very interesting thing occurred to me as I attempted to format this into a physical book. This is an incredibly musical medium. I mean, I went through a lot of those screens deliberately where you get a sense that there's a line, 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 there's a paragraph. It's got a music to it. Things pass quickly or they pass slowly, and as an author, you can work with all those things. You can pace your work. It has a dynamic range which you can use to your own effect. That dynamic range is very important. The difference between a small word on a complete blank screen or an entire screen filled with text. That would be the dynamic range of the work. And then, of course, bring in images. So as the author, it gives you musical elements that you can work with. One way to think about this work would be as a film animation, just screen after screen in a strictly controlled serial presentation. That serial presentation will change with each and every reader, but it's strictly serial. It's simply one screen after another. So I found it almost impossible to get that kind of music into a fixed form. And the postage stamps, which as you can see clearly function as narrative elements, you choose them based on curiosity, and you go to a place based on the stamp. It's impossible to do that with this book. The stamps are merely illustrations beside a text. You never choose the stamp. It's a transparent media. We're all familiar with how the book works. We all know to turn one page from the next. The stamps can only ever be secondary illustrations to the text. They can never function as navigational elements here. So I'll pass it around. Feel free to flip through it and look at it.
Any questions?
This might be I'm not sure if this is a crass question or not, but what's your take on the idea of converting works like this to an online version?
Online version. Well, as the author of the work and as the person who wants to see their words live on forever, I'm all for it. My publisher, however, would be in disagreement with me about that. That's maybe a little bit of a flippant answer. The more serious answer would be that the work as it exists in this format has a resonance with the time it was written. And that's very, very important to try to preserve. It wouldn't be that difficult to emulate this in HTML, even with just the graphics from the screenshots. And you would have a really good representation of how the work functioned. So if it could be done like that, I would probably not have many qualms about hosting it like that.
So there's an author, Judy Malloy's one of the artists that I've been following for many years, and she has 7 versions of one of her works called Uncle Roger. And the first 3 versions were standalone computer floppy disk types. And then she jumped to the web in 1995, one of the first authors to produce for the web. And the version is so different from the previous 3 versions. But the reason why she likes it so much is that it's available. You know, so it became for her the official version of her work. We have another question here, Matt, and then I have one online from Ricardo.
First of all, thank you for the line, travel is a conversation between places. That stuck with me immediately. It's still sticking with me, so thank you very much for that. But this is less of a question and more of a request for you to explain the technological situation in 1993. I was in high school at that time, and I remember being on AOL Chat. That's what we were doing. I hadn't heard about the World Wide Web yet. And what I love about this work is it really forefronts the fact that literature was there first. Literature, hypertext was being imagined by artists like yourself as a creative force. And I'm wondering if you could just have a revelry about that early moment of hypertext and sort of what it's become now, this place of danger, of international intrigue between nations, hacking each other and so forth. Just where do you see your creativity and this art sitting within this larger global technological context?
Oh, those are not tiny questions. Okay, well, let me address the first question first, which is what's the situation of things in 1994, 1993. During that time, and this is a thread, I think, if you read through any documents by artists or look at old magazines of the time, a lot of artist advocacy was to try to get access to the infrastructure on behalf of the artists. Filmmaking is probably the best example of this, where filmmaking equipment is horrendously expensive, and your individual artists didn't have the resources or means to get at that equipment. But the same holds true to a lesser extent for things like printmaking and audio production and so on. So I had to author this work because I had attended the University of Western Ontario. I was an alumni, and I was able to get nighttime access at the computer lab, which had just been opened up in the philosophy department. And so I had access to scanners and, at the time, quite cutting-edge technology, which I personally could never have afforded. So that's the case of institutional access, allowing the artist to produce the work. And for me, that worked. I'd worked with 2 other individuals, Robin Parmar and C.J. Keep, on a research project investigating hypertext use for literary authors, and this predated this work. And so as a result from that, we got evaluation copies of hypertext, and that's how we got the StorySpace software. I've since purchased StorySpace software for myself to use, but the key point about writing in that era is that access to computer technology was extremely limited and not at all easy to get, and had to be done. I mean, that you had to work throughout the night and go home as dawn was coming up to get the work done. Your question about hypertext very, very quickly went from something that nobody understood at all, and it was very difficult to explain in a social situation, to something that once the World Wide Web became popularized, everybody knew what hypertext was. Interestingly, the structures around hypertext today very quickly evolved to avoid any kind of lost in hyperspace or cyberspace technology. The browser back return buttons, the breadcrumbs, the history, everything. Everything was set up to avoid the kind of lostness which these types of works somewhat encourage. So in that way, it's a little bit harder to get a work to function on the World Wide Web the same way this does. This is a standalone work. The experience of reading one of these is similar to going to the theater as opposed to surfing on Netflix. On Netflix, your investment in the movie is 2 or 3 clicks away. If you take the time to go to the theater, buy your ticket, get your popcorn, settle in your seat, you're probably not going to leave unless it's a really rank movie. You're probably going to give it a lot of options to move you. So that's the analogy between standalone hypertext and works that are web-based and films on Netflix and in the theater. The larger question, I'm happy that I've remembered all 3 aspects of your question. The larger question about the international community and the dangers of hypertext, I think, are more to do with nations have always been fractious, and that's probably more of an internet and communications question, I would say, rather than hypertext having any culpability and encouraging nations to be ill-behaved towards each other.
Actually, we get along quite well. Ricardo's asking online, did you take into account that the fact that contemporary readers are also social media users when devising your story? Of course, you know, the answer would be probably not, since this was written so long ago. But if not, though, would you do it now? Has your perception changed in this regard?
Well, that brings up a couple of interesting points. One, I found out Dene and I were talking, and she explained how she conducted some of the traversals in her classroom, and they were much more social events than I had originally imagined. I thought that was a very good, a really good idea. The one's relationship to a hypertext in a reading is always, I would argue, a much more private act than just reading a traditional book. Because if I read a traditional book, let's say I have a voice in my head that's what the words say on the page, and so I hear that voice, it's the narrative. If I go to a literary reading, the author just reproduces and announces to the gathered audience what that voice is. They just read the text out loud. And in an author's reading, there may be an additional level of meaning because it's the author. How do they give inflection? Are they a nice person? Do they seem a little creepy? You know, all those things you can read into the actual presentation by the author, so that's a secondary level. But really, it's just that same voice that I get when I read announced to the audience. When performing a hypertext in front of a group, you have that second layer of why am I choosing the words I'm choosing? In my case, why am I clicking on this stamp rather than this other one? What's the implication of this destination rather than that destination? That layer of meaning is very, very difficult to convey in a group setting like this. So our solution to that is to throw it out to the audience to help make decisions as we traverse the text. That's turned out to be quite well with this group, and it's a nice small group, so we can get that kind of dynamic going. But it's quite difficult to bring that into the performative aspect. And then just to provide a little bit more information, I want to talk about how I've presented works in around the era of 1994 that were hypertext based. At that time, you couldn't get a digital projector for under a couple $1,000 if you needed it for work. So I presented one work at the Vancouver International Writers Festival, which was a web-based hypertext. And so what we did, it was photographically based. You select a person's face from a group photograph, and you encounter a descriptive text about them. You go back to the group photograph, select another face. So we imitated it with slides. And we had a fix. We put a plant in the audience who was going to select the faces from the group photo, but we had it all planned ahead of time which one they were going to choose and which slide was going to come next. So, like late 20th century capitalism, it had the illusion of choice, but there was no choice.
I was going to mention, along those lines, once again, Judy Malloy was playing around, and her first version of Uncle Roger was in a BBS. So you might know that in the early, late 80s, there was a technology that allowed people to come online through the net, right, the internet. And they would come together at night and hang out and post things to each other. And when they would post, you would post it and then you go to sleep, and the next morning you get a response. It was not synchronous, it was asynchronous communication. So you would have a conversation with someone, but it might take a couple of days for someone to read your post, have time to respond to it, and then you to get it. But this is how people had social media experiences back in those days. And so when she did Uncle Roger, while her Uncle Roger was posted in the BBS environment, which is where it was in the first iteration, somebody else, Howard Rheingold, set up a secondary system so that people could post about the work simultaneously in this BBS environment, so that people could read and then post, and then she could get up and read it and then respond to it later. So there was this conversation going on like a Facebook or Twitter, but it would take a couple of days for that to unfold. And we have records of those responses to her postings, which I think is very interesting to go back and look. It's just like a Twitter feed with somebody saying, "Oh, so what are you wearing when you're posting this?" Or, did you get some? Are you drinking? What coffee are you drinking while you're, posting this? So a lot of that kind of personal response that you get in a Twitter environment that you would not necessarily do here, right? You wouldn't ask those questions here. So I think that's kind of interesting to think about.
So as aging hypertext authors, we get to say, oh, it's so much quicker now. It's so fast-paced today. In our day, things were slow and took time.
Yeah, icebound. Any more questions about this?
Yeah, I'm a bit older than Matt, so when you were working on this, I was actually probably an undergraduate writing student and then a graduate English student, and like hypertext at the time was going to be the big thing. It was going to absolutely transform kind of literature and writing, and I think around the same time they were even talking the same about virtual reality. Neither of them really came up, but they certainly virtual reality and maybe hyperliterature are kind of back in again. What's your kind of perspective of watching that kind of ups and downs and things like Twine that's allowing kind of a new generation to really experiment with hyperliterature?
I think hypertext has taken over. If you look at the World Wide Web as being facilitated by hypertext, it's just not hypertext fiction. I'll just put that back up. So I think it has completely taken over in that way. Twine I haven't actually used, so I think what happened in terms of my writing experience and the time that I was writing was that these standalone projects there was much more of an investment necessary to get them done as compared to the World Wide Web. And for those of us looking to get ideas out and to have a readership and to produce works that you could have 100% control of, obviously the World Wide Web was the way to go. You needed to know your HTML skills and how to upload and code on a very superficial level. So the threshold was actually quite low to get these kind of works up. So we just kind of switched over, unless you wanted to do a more monumental work, in which case, by and large, Eastgate, the sellers of Story Space, was the way to go.
This computer sold for $1,600 when it was released. And if you think about it today, that's well over $3,000, close to $4,000. Most of you, if you're running a PC, you may have spent $1,000 on that computer. So this was an elite object. And most of us who had access to this either had it through our universities, or if our families had businesses and they had to use computers, we had it that way. So it really was hard. And the Apple was expensive, not necessarily the PCs, but the Apple objects were. And so that's one of the deterrents for folks getting involved in this in an early day. And the Story Space was selling for over $100, right?
$250.
Yeah, $250. So that was expensive. And as a graduate student, I was collecting all this. I started collecting all this stuff in '91, and it was $29.99 as a graduate student in '91. And my stipend was, what, $600 a month? So you figure, you do the math, how much could I afford? Could I afford it every month? And the answer is no, I'd have to save up to buy one. So my collection was meager when I started, but as people realized I was saving it, they began sending me copies. So that's how I, got a lot of copies. Kathleen Zoller, she's one of the undergraduate researchers in the lab. She asks, she's Dene Larson, who's another ELED artist. Dene Larson once emphasized how structure equals meaning. How would you say that structure reflects meaning in your work? Talked about this last night at dinner.
Where to start?
I know.
I mean, this work it's all about the structure. The structure influences all of the meanings. So then the task begins is to kind of parse it down and say what type of structure influences it in which ways, which would lead me to the graphic interface. For my, okay, there's classic hypertext such as Victory Garden and Afternoon, and if I use those two as examples, they're almost entirely text only. And the universe that you encounter when the work can seem to be infinite, in that you encounter a screen of text and you're not sure of the scope of the work, how far it extends. And you're not sure of your investment into the work as well. And Michael Joyce has the famous comment that your entry into the work begins when it begins and it ends as soon as you leave it. And Stuart Moulthrop has joked, and that can be 1 or 2 screens later, depending on the person. So I really wanted to create a navigational structure that would allow the user to dip in and dip out again in a way that I thought was commensurate with both the material and a user's tolerance for screens of information. I would just like you to imagine being the author of this work and trying to show a colleague or a friend. Your only options were to invite them into your studio where you had your computer and fire it up for them. It's almost impossible to casually show somebody your hypertext, right? There's pretty much no way to do so. And when this was being authored, I would have to take somebody up into the computer lab at midnight and say, well, let me show you what I'm working on. So, yeah, never used it, but. But back to the structure. So this structure was deliberately chosen as a way to descend into and come back and allow curiosity, especially imagetic curiosity, to drive the work forward. And then once you're, without ever confronting that feeling that you just, I don't know, there must just be way more screens of information than I can handle here. I also wanted it to read more like poetry, in that I wanted it to have some sort of closure at the end of a series of narrative passages. I did want it to function a bit more like a short story or poetry, in that you've consumed this chunk of text, and now you can do the work of understanding it and playing with it and unpacking it, but it's almost modular.
So there was a time, you might know the Beat Poets. Some of you might be familiar with Beat Poets, and Burroughs' work with cut-up poetry. If you're not, what he would do is cut up, bits and pieces of paper and then put that together into, a text. And so the idea of cut-up poetry was very influential in early hypertext development. And so a lot of the early hypertext authors that were writing novels like, Michael Joyce and Stuart Moulthrop, and those doing the early serious hypertext work, were interested in how to break up a text, and still tell a story, right? How to fragment. The whole notion of fragmentation was a big part of that, postmodern sensibility that they were responding to. And yet, at the same time, there were artists that were pushing against that norm and saying, well, that's fine, we can break it up, but how do we put it back together? Because there is a satisfaction of experiencing not a complete text, but a contained amount of text, right? And so I think that speaks to what you're doing here, where you have the tunnel and you're moving through the frontispiece, the backpiece, and you have the wave of returns, which is when you hit the return key and you move through a text in a linear fashion. We call that the wave of returns. It's Michael Joyce's term for it. Whereas a lot of artists wanted you not to experience that. So Bill Bly's We Descend, he really doesn't want you to hit the return key. He wants you to play with the hyperlinks because he wants that experience to be an archive as opposed to a novel. I mean, that's the point of that story. So I think it's interesting how every artist took a different bent towards this technology, and you get such a flavor of possibilities with each work.
And I would like to suggest that probably is tied to the author's imagining what the reader is and what their tolerance for disruption or text is. So you probably have an idea of how much they can tolerate or what's going to interest them or what kind of payoff you want, and that's going to influence how you write your work.
What's missing on the screen, I don't think we can do this, but in an environment like in my lab, many of these hypertexts will have this interface, but behind that, as you move that interface over, is another interface. It's a secondary interface of all the boxes. So you would see, if you put down the Tinkerbell keys, the Option Apple key, all the little boxes show up around those. So you see that now you see the boxes. But in most story space hypertext, those boxes show up in the back of that interface and with all the lines drawn to each other. So you can actually navigate not through the front end, but through more of a middle end, because the back end is actually the coding, right? So this middle end, the secondary end of this work. And that was another real fun way, because then you can explore the nodes and the paths in a way you don't necessarily see. This is a much more fluid, artistic experience, a more novelistic experience than the technological experience of the boxes and the lines that the artist would have to do, right?
One of the joys of authoring these types of works is when you're working in that interface, so let's call it the back end, that's the back end of the story space interface, where each screen of text here is a little box. And all those links that we chose are actually lines that connect one box to another box. So when you load in your work after you've been constructing it and get it to a certain level, what you're presented with is a screen, the boxes appear, and then all these lines very slowly start to appear. And there is one compulsion just to make those lines as dense as possible. And because it's an aspect of the graphic interface that you're working with. You see all the lines, you go, let's make them really dense. Let's see how much we can do. And it's just one of those haptic motivations.
Yeah. We have time for one more question. Does anyone else have a question in the audience or online, on site? May I say thank you? So, I want to thank everybody for coming today, but I want to especially thank John Durno, who reached out and invited us, me and my team, to join us today. Greg Philbrook is on sound. He's the technological guru of my program. He was a graduating person from my program, and I hired him because he's just so brilliant. John Barber's faculty in my program. He's a sound artist and does web design and teaches usability. And then, of course, the students in my lab that are participating right now and helping with the online site audience. But thank you, John, for allowing us to come from Vancouver here to give this wonderful experience and for me to finally meet Tim, whom I never met before until last night. I ran into him in the street and I went, "Are you Tim? You look like your picture." And he said, "Yes, I am." So we had a nice dinner last night, and I want to thank you for all the artifacts that you've given to the Electronic Literature Organization to maintain for you and your art.
Well, I feel compelled to publicly acknowledge and thank you for your heroic efforts to preserve not only the technology, but especially the e-lit that you're doing.
And one more thing, electronic literature, if you don't know what that is, we should have probably said this earlier, it's born digital literature. It's literature you can't read by generally just printing it out, or you need some sort of computing device to experience it. And it was produced on a computer, right? So it's very different than a handwritten novel or something like that. So there's a lot of work out there today, and if you play with twine, even if you like something like Stanley Parables, so many of you probably know that game, that's considered electronic literature. So happy to talk to you later about that. Thank you once again. Thank you, Tim.